Hello, I am Tamara, and today we are having a Ray Quilt tie-dye showdown. So let me know in the description down below which one you like better and which one you are going to try. And I am going to walk you through everything that I did for both of these rag quilt tie-dyes. Each rag quilt used a different tie-dyeing technique, and each rag quilt turned out, in my opinion, awesome. I love how they turned out, and I hope that you guys are excited to try this technique with me. So let's get started. But before we jump into the tutorial, I just want to ask you to please give it a thumbs up, and if you like sewing tutorials like this, definitely hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because that really does help this channel spread to other beginner sewers as well, and that is my goal, to reach beginner sewers. So let's jump into this tutorial now. Both rag quilts are made with 100% cotton. That is very important. Both rag quilts I pre-washed to make sure that anything that was on them from the manufacturer has been taken off before I started the process. I will link to the tutorial that I used. I used my how to make a rag quilt without cutting squares technique for both of these rag quilts, but I did the tutorial for my colored one ahead of time. So I made this entire rag quilt before I tie-dyed it. And then this rag quilt, I actually took the front and the back and I tie-dyed the fabric separately before I turned it into a rag quilt. So the colorful rag quilt, I ended up using a set by Tulip. It came with a whole bunch of these little bottles and they had the powdered dye inside them. I filled them up with water and then I was able to do a rag quilt. Now a quick warning about this. This says it dyes up to 30 projects. If you are doing a baby rag quilt, you can probably get 2 rag quilts out of this, but I would not count on doing any more than 2 baby blankets with one of these kits. So the way that I chose to prep this baby rag quilt was, of course, to make the rag quilt ahead of time, and then I just pinched in the center of the quilt and pulled up. That gave me a roll, and then once you have that roll, then just grab a whole bunch of elastics and tie elastics all the way down that roll. Now, if you find your rag quilt is larger and it's hard to get those elastics wrapped around nice and tight in the middle, what you can use are zip ties if you can get long enough zip ties. So that's another option if you don't want to use elastics. And once you've added all your elastics to your rag quilt, then it's time to get your tie-dyeing kit out and get all of those bottles prepped and ready. Now, of course, follow your tie-dyeing kit's instructions, but I just want to share a little tip here, which is to have a look at the bottom of each bottle after you've filled it and shaken it up, because sometimes the powder gets stuck in the bottom there, so it needs a good shake to get all of that powder throughout the water. And now it's time to drench our rag quilt with all of the different colored dyes in whatever order you wish. So this middle section here that I'm working on is actually going to be the hardest section, and I did do 2 bottles full of that color for my middle section because I really wanted it to soak through into the center of that tube. So that middle section and the one to the right, I did 2 bottles worth of dye, and then all of the rest of the sections I just did a single douse with 1 bottle. And once you've completed the dyeing process, then make sure you have a large enough bag that you can stick your blanket in and just wrap it up so that not too much air gets to that blanket, because you are going to have it sit for around 6 hours and you want it to be wet and soaking through all of the layers. And once you've let it sit for the appropriate amount of time, then it's time to take it out of the bag, remove the elastics, and then you are going to rinse it out and you are going to squeeze it and continue rinsing. That way you make sure that as much dye as possible is out. So essentially you're going to rinse it until the water runs clear. And then take it to the washing machine and throw it through your washer alone or with some old towels. And then of course in the dryer, and that will complete the tie-dyeing process. And this is the finished result of the first tie-dye blanket that we did. And I have to say, I love this method. I love how the tie-dye turned out on the front, on the back. It just has a really nice look to it. It flows together beautifully, and I love how the tie-dye interacts with the ragging without it all being cut up and then ruins your tie-dye effect. So that's how I did my colorful rag quilt. And then for my plain, well, I shouldn't say plain, for my single color rag quilt, I used a different technique, and for that technique, I used this Rit Dye product. So I will link to this in the description down below as well, and you can check that out for yourself. And this product is cool because it didn't need as much dyeing time. This one you soaked in the sink for between 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the saturation that you wanted on your rag quilt, and then you rinsed it out and you were done. Now the plan for this one was to actually put a third piece of flannel in between these two layers, and then I could have a really nice darker rag quilt line. I suggest either adding a color that's completely contrast to this, so like a hot pink in the center would be a lot of fun seeing that intermingled with the blue tie-dyed look, or a white, and then it just gives it a bit more of a pure look once it's all finished. And you can't do that with the first method that we tried, but you can do it with the second method because we're actually dyeing our fabric first before we do the no-cut rag quilt tutorial. And of course, when you're just tie-dyeing fabric before you're tie-dyeing a blanket, you can really choose whatever tie-dye method you desire. So I decided to try two different methods. This first piece of fabric will end up on the back of my rag quilt, and all I did was I just bunched up little circles and I tied elastics around all of the little balls, and I tried to get as much fabric as I could. That way you don't end up with chunks of your fabric that are laying in the dye, because then you're essentially just dyeing it that color instead of giving it the tie-dye effect. And I have to say, I love how this one turned out because you could really see the difference between the white portions of the blanket and the dyed portions of the blanket. Whereas this next method is actually going to give a softer version of a tie-dyed look. So this is the scrunch method. So you'll just grab sections of your fabric and you'll kind of scrunch them up together. Make sure again that you're not leaving any sections open, because any flat sections will end up soaking up all of the dye. And on this, I did end up missing one section, which you might be able to catch in the rag quilt if you look closely. So try your best to scrunch all that fabric up. That way there is no fabric left that has not been properly scrunched. And then it's time to follow the instructions on our Rit bottle. I filled up my sink with boiling water and then added a cup of salt, a teaspoon of laundry detergent, and about a half a bottle of the dye. And then it was time to submerge my fabric, and throughout the 45 minutes that I left it in the sink, I just came back to it about every 10 minutes and I would rotate the fabric and I would stir it around a little bit to keep the process going. And then once my fabric was done soaking in the dye, it was time to drain the sink, take all the elastics off, and then rinse out the fabric until the water runs clear. And then of course, throw it through your washer and your dryer. And once they come out of the dryer, this is what they should look like. Now, I had originally planned on putting a third piece of fabric, this teal color here, in between the two layers. I thought it would look really nice, but it just was the wrong color teal in the end. So like I suggested earlier, I would definitely do like a hot pink or a nice white in between the two layers if you want your ragging to pop. For the sake of this tutorial, I chose not to do a third layer. So here I've got both pieces of fabric, right sides out, wrong sides facing in, and I'm just going to trim around the entire outer edge so that I can get a nice square piece of fabric before I move on to all of the steps that you need to follow for the no cutting rag quilt. And then this is the finished product. I really love how it turned out, and I love how using the no cutting rag quilt tutorial allows the rag quilt and the tie-dye itself to still be a bit of a cohesive unit within the blanket. If you do end up doing this, definitely check out my tutorial as well on how to wash rag quilts. I would love to hear which one you are planning on doing, so definitely let me know. And hit that thumbs up if you found this tutorial fun, helpful, inspiring in any way. I hope that you have a wonderful day, a wonderful summer, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.